So welcome back, guys. This lecture we will be talking about React AppContext. So before now, props have been used to pass properties or data from one parent component to a child component. But this becomes stressful for a big project where we have numerous child components existing inside another child component. So for you to be able to send props from a parent component to a child component that is inside another child component, you will have to now prop it down 2 levels, which is very stressful. In our home component, home.js, we were able to prop the name of this object, which is goat, and the color of this object, which is red, to our home item.js component, because our home component was the parent component while our home item.js was our child component. So it was easy for us to prop down this data to the home item component because it's just one layer. But imagine that we have so many layers and we intend to update a particular component which exists inside another component. It will be quite difficult for us to access that component because we will have to prop down the number of layers that is available. So this challenge gave rise to the new React Context API, which makes use of the context provider which you use to define the data you want to store. So this data you want to store will be defined in your context provider, and it also makes use of the context consumer. The context consumer receives and uses the data that have been provided by the context provider. AppContext makes the properties of an object available to any consumer.context component. That is, any property that is being provided by the provider context component becomes available to the consumer context component. And it is both automatically updated in the consumer component and the provider component. This solves the constraint encountered by the props, which is limited to the parent-child component. So let's go over to our code and let's execute this in our project, because it will be very relevant for us to use it in our project since we will be updating our cart later on in this course. So the first thing we'll be creating under our source component, our source folder, I'll create a new file and call that file appcontext.js. I'll be starting with appcontext.js, and inside of my appcontext.js, I will have to import React from React. Then I'll say let AppContext equal to React dot create context as a function. So I will have to now also export default app context. Default app context. The reason we are doing this is because normally in each page we are supposed to use app context equal to React.create context in any page that we intend to use the React app context. But since we are using a class-based component, it is only of best opinion that we put our React app context in its own component. So that is why I've created a component and called it AppContext.js. So the next thing we are going to do is to make our route our provider. Normally, like I said earlier on, that if you want to make a provider, you want to make any of the components your provider, it's just for you to wrap everything in a context.provider wrapper, and for that reason we'll be using our route.js as our provider. So let's go about making our app.js our provider. So for me to make my route my provider, what I'm going to do, I'm going to import AppContext that I've just created. Import AppContext from what? So I'm importing AppContext into my route. So after I've imported my AppContext from AppContext, which I just created, the next thing I'll do, I will have to now wrap everything that is inside my route, everything that I'm returning, inside the AppContext.provider. So what I'm going to do, I'm just going to cut this using Ctrl X away first, and now create something called AppContext.provider. At this time, I will paste back what I had in my route. So what this means in essence is that my route is now serving as a provider to send any data that I have in my route to my home component and all other components that I will be creating inside my route. So the next thing I'll be doing inside this my route is to now create a constructor method. And inside my constructor, colon super, so the super function. So this the state be equal to nothing for now, which I'll be bringing in things from wherever they are currently to my route. So now whatever we put inside this my state and whatever we put in my route will now be sent to my entire page using a value inside curly braces, this dot state. What it means is that everything, the state of my route component, I'm sending the value of this dot state to every part component in my project. So but currently I only have one component, which is my home component, and every other component in this my project is linked to what? My home component. If you can see, every other thing is linked to my home component. My navbar, my footer, my sidebar, they are all linked to my home component. So whenever I want to send something from my route to any component, it will be very easy to send that in. Now that I've created AppContext.provider and I've made my route my provider, I will go over to any component that I want to use as my consumer of whatever I will be sending from my route, which is the first component that will serve as a consumer is my home.js. So in that home.js, what I'm going to do, I'm going to now import AppContext, like I did earlier for the provider. AppContext from, do not forget to put your quotation mark, from what? AppContext. So with this, I've imported AppContext to this project. So the next thing I'm going to do, I'm going to go down to before my export default home, and I'm going to create something called my consumer receiver. It is this that receives whatever the provider is sending. Without this, my home cannot receive whatever my provider is sending. So what I'm going to do, underneath this, I'm going to say home, which is the name of my component, dot context type is equal to AppContext With this, any data I want to pass from my route to my home, it will be easy for me to pass that data directly towards my home. So I'm just going to do a quick example using what we already have here. So normally in my home, I already have a constructor method that receives something from my server. So what I'm going to do, I'm just going to copy what I'm receiving from my server. I'm going to copy my array out and taking it to my route. And now I'm in my route. I'll paste it here. I'm trying to make my route a provider to my home component. So after I'm done with that, I will clean up, I'll take away this constructor method, because my route is now the one receiving the array. So I'll go back to my home.js and also copy the component did mount and cut it out, go back to my route and paste it in my route. Just follow me. I go back to my home. Now we no longer have anything here. Remember, I imported get animals from repo. This is no longer functional here, so I'm going to also cut it out and go back to my route and paste it here. So those so much details that were in my home will no longer be there, those stressful details. So at this point, the only thing I'm going to change in my home for now, since we are no longer passing it from the state, I'm going to remove this dot state and change it to this dot context dot what animals. So if we go over to our browser and refresh, you will find out that everything is still working the way it's supposed to work. Why? Because my route has served as a provider and passed those information using the app context and sends those information to my home.js, which received it using this dot context. Remember, in our route we used this dot state and now gave the value this.state, sending it to our home. So whatever is in our this.state here, which is our animals, and these details here, this is the current state. Whatever is here is what is now passed down to our home.js. So if we have more than one component inside of this place, if I should create more components, the route will still serve as a provider to that component. And if I want to receive that details from this route, the only thing I'm just going to do, I'm just going to receive it by importing AppContext from AppContext and going down to the ending of my React my component and calling the name home.context type is equal to AppContext. We will use it more on subsequent files as we progress in this course. See you guys in the next lecture. I hope you understand this React AppContext. If you actually did not get the full details of how it works, I would advise you repeat this video and go over it one after the other, paying details to the little things that we have done. I started with creating a component, AppContext.js. I imported React from React. Let AppContext be equal to React.createReactContext function, which is according to the documentation of React, the documentation of React AppContext API, and exported the default AppContext. Now, after doing that, I went over to my route, which I'm using as my provider, and I imported the AppContext from AppContext. Then went over to my render method. Under my return, I created a tag called AppContext.provider with a closing tag and wrapped it. Use this tag to wrap my entire route. So I gave it a value this.state because I will be sending everything from my state towards any of my consumer. So whatever is in my state is now made available to all my consumers. So any file that I want to use as a consumer, I'll just go over to import AppContext from AppContext, then go to the last before the closing, the export default home, and call the name of the component .context type equal to AppContext. See you guys in the next lecture while we use this for more examples.